My wife won $9 million in the lottery, filed for divorce, and kicked me out. But she forgot about the prenup that her parents had forced me to sign before our marriage. I am from a humble family. My parents live in a quiet suburb. After high school, I worked a variety of odd jobs, including bartending, helping at my uncle's hardware store, and eventually managing a local sporting goods store. It was not glamorous, but it was genuine. My wife, on the other hand, came from a world I had never known. Her parents owned several properties, drove expensive automobiles, and threw enormous extravagant parties a few times every year. Let's name my father-in-law Phil and my mother-in-law Meal. Meal was a tall, imposing figure who exuded quiet power in every setting. He'd make casual comments that seemed more like disguised threats or manipulations. Meal was also good at gently expressing disapproval. Just one raised eyebrow could make others shrink. They were never blatantly nasty in front of me, but I could always sense their displeasure behind the polite talk. After my wife and I got engaged, I learned how much her parents feared that outsiders would take their family assets. They treated me like an intruder despite the fact that my wife and I had been dating for years. Before we could set a wedding date, Phil insisted that I sign a prenuptial agreement. I didn't have the money to fight it legally, and I was too consumed by love. I kept telling myself it was a symbolic gesture to placate her parents. Isn't love the only promise I needed? The day I signed is very clear in my mind. It was a warm afternoon in her parents' huge house. Neil spread out the document and slipped a pen in my direction. He gave me coffee, almost as if it were a regular business transaction. My wife stood to the side and said little. That hurt, but I dismissed it, assuming it wouldn't matter in the long term. The contract stated that any gifts, inheritances, or trust funds from her family remained her own property. However, any big items we acquired together, such as a house or lottery winnings, would be marital property. That seemed unusual to me, but all I wanted was to marry her. 6 months later, we married in a beautiful lakeside wedding. My parents were overwhelmed by the luxury, yet remained supportive. My father's expression was tense as he greeted my in-laws. He'd always taught me to trust my instincts, but I assumed love would remove any doubts. The first several years passed without any noteworthy incidents. We resided in a condominium that her parents helped us get. I made monthly payments on the mortgage, despite the fact that the down payment came from her father's gift. Looking back, it was never actually a gift, but rather a tool for controlling us. But back then, I assumed this was how wealthy families operated. Our marriage had the normal money squabbles and occasional outbursts about our parents interfering with our decisions. They'd arrive unexpectedly, bring new furniture or decor, and occasionally reorganize our entire living space without notice. My wife would dismiss my frustration, blaming it on her parents' supportive nature. Then came the day that everything flipped upside down. My wife called me ecstatic to tell me she had won a $9 million lottery prize with a random ticket she purchased at a petrol station. At first I was overjoyed, fantasizing about quitting our jobs and exploring the world. But my excitement gradually faded. She insisted we keep it a secret, even from my parents. She got strangely paranoid, talking about claiming the money correctly and meeting with lawyers I'd never met before. When I asked to attend these meetings, she told me I'd be out of place, which stung. I had no idea the main surprise was about to occur. One afternoon I returned home from work, fatigued, to discover her searching through drawers with her aunt. She casually announced that she was filing for divorce and instructed me to pack my bags and leave the apartment, which she claimed was under her name. I was floored. Sure, I paid monthly mortgage payments, but she clearly thought her father's original down payment and her newfound wealth rendered me useless. I felt my heart break. I contacted my father, my voice cracking, and told him I had just been booted out of my own home. It was the ultimate treachery. The biggest shock came next. I learned that my father-in-law had sent his personal attorney to protect her. They wanted me out so they could keep the lotto earnings separate from me. Except they'd forgotten the provisions of the prenuptial agreement they'd forced on me. Instead of completely protecting their daughter, it declared that any windfall obtained during marriage counted as a shared asset. I then understood that if they insisted on divorcing me immediately after winning the jackpot, I decided to go cautiously. My father advised me to remain calm. I was determined not to fold. They'd thrown down the gauntlet, treating me like a disposable annoyance. If they believed I'd walk away peacefully, they were greatly mistaken. I spent a few nights at my folks' house attempting to process the shock. My mother was furious, shouting about how rude my in-laws had been from the beginning. My father, while also outraged, remained pragmatic. He contacted an old buddy, a family law attorney, and scheduled an appointment for me first thing in the morning. Sitting in that attorney's office, I felt a mixture of rage and relief. I told him about how my in-laws insisted on the prenup, how my wife had earned $9 million, and how she then surprised me with a divorce. He chuckled as he reviewed the prenuptial agreement. They shot themselves in the foot, he told me. They specifically included language that lumps lottery winnings under marital assets. Unless a judge does some wild legal interpretation, you are entitled to a substantial portion. This was a lifeline for me. I was scared the prenup would keep me out, but it turned out that their fear of me claiming inherited wealth outweighed the potential of a jackpot scenario. My lawyer cautioned that it wouldn't be simple. My in-laws were wealthy, well-connected, and likely to deploy a large legal team. But he believed we had a good case, especially since I had contributed financially to the marriage and had been unceremoniously evicted from our shared residence. I inquired about the divorce proceedings in our state. A disputed divorce can last months or longer, but if my wife's side realizes they are on shaky ground, they may seek an early settlement. The lawyer warned that they would use intimidation or underhanded tactics to persuade me to give away my rights cheaply. Within a few days, my father-in-law left me a frightening message asking me to back off, claiming that I deserved nothing from his daughter. He threatened that if I sought to collect the lottery prize, he would ensure I received nothing. My lawyer instructed me to document everything. Then my mother-in-law cornered me outside my parents' house. She portrayed it as a fantastic bargain, but it wasn't even enough to cover half of my mortgage payments. I declined stating weed. She scoffed, perplexed by my refusal, obviously unaccustomed to anyone refusing her money. With negotiations at a deadlock, my lawyer filed petitions to prevent the lottery money from being hidden or moved. That incensed my in-laws, who began spreading rumors about me being a gold digger who preyed on their young daughter. It stung, but I remained strong. My supervisor, who owned the sporting goods store, had my back, dismissing my father-in-law's attempts to interfere with my employment. Friends took sides, some calling me petty. The stress was unbearable, but I refused to succumb. We finally got a court date after several weeks of unsuccessful negotiations. My wife was not to be found personally. She was practically under her parents' protective wing, avoiding any direct communication with me. She let her lawyers do the talking, alleging I was a leech who gave nothing to the marriage. My lawyer objected, citing financial records, bill time sharing, and a specific prenuptial clause regarding windfalls. We also discussed how I had been violently kicked out of the condo. The judge directed both parties to prepare for a more formal hearing on asset partition. In one final attempt at intimidation, my father-in-law threatened my employer again, who swiftly instructed him to leave. That simply made my father-in-law angrier. My lawyer advised us to proceed carefully, but he was certain that a judge would see through their scare tactics. Nothing could have prepared me for the ultimate fight in court, but I knew the law was on my side. Paradoxically, because of the very prenup, weeks passed, and the anticipation for the approaching hearing reached fever pitch. My wife still avoided direct contact with me, but her lawyers inundated me with motions. They maintained that the lottery gain was separate property because she purchased the ticket despite the fact that the prenup stated that any large windfall during marriage was marital. Meanwhile, my father-in-law attempted to ruin my reputation among friends and business acquaintances by spreading the myth that I was a gold digger who had married into the family purely for money. During this time, I had a combination of frustration and motivation. If they thought they could bully me out of my rights, they were mistaken. I had records that demonstrated how I contributed to our shared existence. My attorney and I went over every element of the prenup. He highlighted a significant clause stating that any pecuniary windfalls, including but not limited to lottery or game show winnings, are deemed marital assets unless expressly stated differently. It was as if my in-laws had accidentally left a back door open. A week before the hearing, we held a preliminary status conference. My wife arrived with her parents and a team of lawyers for attorneys and a financial advisor. They looked at me with the same air of superiority, but their attitude softened when my lawyer quietly showed the prenuptial agreement, emphasizing the specific clause about lottery money. The judge listened attentively, appeared unimpressed by their attempts to dismiss the case, and ordered that all substantial assets be frozen until the main hearing. That same day my mother-in-law cornered me outside the courthouse, insisting we speak like adults. She tried to provide a flat payment that was much lower than before, calling it generous for someone of my background. I refused again, telling her that we'd let the judge decide. She snapped, claiming I was destroying the family, as if I had surprised her daughter with a divorce. The hypocrisy made my blood boil, but I remained calm. My lawyer had told me not to engage in heated confrontations that could be used against me later. Behind the scenes, I was terrified that my in-laws might try to hide the lottery earnings in hidden accounts. My lawyer, anticipating this possibility, filed court orders to block any substantial transfers. We also planned to have a forensic accountant ready in case we suspected them of hiding money. My father-in-law's temper flared. He left me a voicemail calling me filthy and accusing me of taking the love from his daughter's life. It was lavish, given that they were the ones who kicked me out immediately after winning the lottery. As the hearing neared, I meticulously planned with my counsel. We practiced my statement to ensure I seemed calm and factual in court. I had papers for the prenup, receipts for the partially paid mortgage, and even texts from my wife confirming our joint bills. The lawyer advised me to keep my reply succinct, but the evidence would speak for itself. If they attempted emotional theatrics, we would respond with precise documentation. On the morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the courthouse, my heart racing. My parents attended for moral support, but remained outside the courtroom. When the proceedings began, I noticed my wife seated near her father, both sporting stone-cold looks. Her mother lingered in the back, arms folded. My father-in-law's lawyers, dressed in glossy suits, were confident, maybe hoping that money and legal strength could overcome the facts. The judge, a severe woman in her 50s, didn't waste time. She invited each side to submit their arguments. My wife's main attorney attempted to portray me as a small contributor who had done little more than share the same living environment. They claimed the lottery purchase was a personal transaction made using her money. But my lawyer calmly reminded them that the prenup specifically included such windfalls as marital property. We also had bank records indicating she had used our joint account card that day. When we presented the information, I noticed visible tension in my father-in-law's camp. The judge inquired whether they had any more paperwork indicating it was her personal money. They fumbled, claiming that the card had been used unintentionally or that it was her father's deposit into the account. But the statements clearly identified our names, not just hers. The judge took note, her attention going to them with anticipation. Eventually, my wife spoke. She said she never intended to upset me and that her parents pushed for a divorce once the prize was won to protect family assets. She fumbled over her words, acknowledging she was under pressure, but also attempting to excuse it by claiming that if anyone found out about the money they would come after us. My lawyer inquired whether she consulted me before making these judgments. She admitted she hadn't. The judge's disdain was evident. By midday it was clear that their prenuptial agreement was a double-edged sword. The exact document they'd used to isolate their money now threatened to put a large sum of lottery prizes in my hands. The court ordered a second hearing for final judgments, noting that she preferred to approach the lottery as a significant marital asset, subject to equitable division. Outside, my father-in-law passed by me mumbling, "This is far from over," but his confidence was clearly shaken. Their desperation grew. In the weeks before the ultimate verdict, my father-in-law's lawyers tried everything, submitting motions to revise the prenuptial agreement's terms, arguing the goal was not to include lottery winnings. The judge dismissed the motions, citing the plain text. My mother-in-law tried to corner me again, warning me that if I hurt their family, I would regret it. I told her straight up that they'd started this by pushing me out and surprising me with a divorce. My wife attempted to contact me, leaving an emotional voicemail expressing her desire for things to end amicably. She offered that if we just had a secret agreement, we might be able to recover some of our relationship. I would have considered it if they had treated me fairly from the beginning, but after the intimidation, falsehoods, and forced removal, my lawyer warned me not to engage in these back-channel discussions. We had a strong legal position and no reason to settle for crumbs. Finally, the day for the final hearing arrived. The courtroom was filled with attorneys from both sides. My father, mother, and a few friends arrived to support me, sitting silently at the back. The judge took the bench, reviewed the amended documents, and approved final remarks. My father-in-law's lead lawyer took one final shot. My lawyer responded with plain facts. They compelled me to sign the prenuptial agreement. It specifically mentioned the lottery and other windfalls as shared property. My father-in-law financed a portion of our condo, but I contributed monthly, so it was not a completely independent asset. Furthermore, the quick divorce petition following the prize was typical evidence of their plan to keep. The judge listened intently and then issued her decision. She stated that the lottery winnings definitely fell under marital assets under the Prenup's terms. She chastised my in-laws for attempting to pervert the agreement they had drafted. She also determined that my wife's abrupt expulsion of me from the condo was unfair, and that I was entitled to repayment for my share of the mortgage and marital contributions. In brief, the judge issued an order stating that I would receive a significant portion of the lottery winnings, as well as compensation for my condo part. We parted ways with a finalization date set for a few weeks later, just to complete papers. My father-in-law's expression was thunderous, and my mother-in-law was incensed, whispering fiercely to him. My wife stood there with tears in her eyes, either from genuine remorse or fury over the loss of so much money. The courtroom settled, the tension thick in the air, as my father-in-law and mother-in-law exchanged angry glances. My wife's eyes were downcast, her expression unreadable, but I could feel the weight of her gaze on me from across the room. She had been torn between her family's expectations and the reality of our marriage, but now the consequences of those decisions were clear. I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that justice had prevailed, and I was finally getting what I was entitled to after years of living in their shadow. Sadness because the woman I had once loved was now standing on the opposite side, emotionally distant and practically a stranger. The judge's words still echoed in my head. She had been clear my in-laws' attempt to manipulate the Prenup had been blatant, and their efforts to dispossess me of my rightful share were as cold and calculated as I had feared. In the end, the law had sided with me. But that didn't change the reality of the situation. I was now a man caught between two worlds, the humble life I had once known and the wealth and power that my ex-wife's family had thrown at me. The final hearing was only the beginning. A few weeks later we met again, this time for the final settlement. My father and mother, once hesitant and unsure, now stood by me with pride. My father-in-law, who had once looked at me with barely concealed disdain, had turned cold and distant. My mother-in-law, ever the manipulator, had been reduced to furious mutterings behind clenched teeth. But I remained resolute. This was no longer about her or them. It was about what I had earned, what I had contributed, and what I was owed. The settlement papers were drawn up meticulously, and despite their attempts to hide the winnings or manipulate the terms, the court had made its decision. I was entitled to half of the lottery prize alongside compensation for the mortgage payments I had made over the years. My contribution to the marriage, both financially and emotionally, had been enough to prove that I had a rightful claim to more than just a small share of the assets. As for the condo, well, that was an entirely different matter. Even though her father had financed part of it, I had paid my dues month after month. That was money I had worked for, and the judge had recognized that. When the final documents were signed, I felt the weight of the past few months lift off my shoulders. The years of intimidation, the taunts, the manipulation, they were behind me, but there was still a lingering sense of loss. I couldn't just erase the years of my life. I wondered if she truly regretted everything, or if her tears were just another attempt to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. As I left the courthouse, the reality of the situation set in. I was free, but I was also alone. My life was about to change dramatically. No longer would I have to worry about the prying eyes of her parents, the whispers at family gatherings, or the constant feeling that I was an outsider in a world that didn't feel like mine. I had been given a fresh start, a chance to rebuild, to live life on my own terms, without the shadow of their expectations hanging over me. But the truth was, it wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming my dignity. They had never seen me as an equal. To them I was always just the son-in-law, the man who had married into the family to be a tool for their wealth. But now I had proven that I was more than that. I was a person with my own worth, my own contributions, and my own rights. I had been humiliated, thrown out like a piece of trash, but I had fought back. And that in itself was worth more than any amount of money. The first few days after the settlement were strange. I stayed with my parents, finding comfort in the quiet, in the familiarity of the life I had once known. My father, ever pragmatic, kept reassuring me that everything would be fine. "You've always had the strength to make your own way," he would say, "and now you've proven it." My mother, on the other hand, was just relieved that the legal battle was over. She was proud of me for standing up to them, for refusing to back down when everything seemed stacked against me. My lawyer, who had been my rock throughout this ordeal, advised me to take the next steps carefully. "You've won," he told me, "but don't let your guard down just yet. They might try something else. If they do, we'll be ready." I appreciated his caution, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The fight had been long, but I had won not just the money, but my self-respect. As for my ex-wife, I didn't know what to feel. There was anger, certainly. How could she have let things get to this point? How could she have been so easily swayed by her family, letting them dictate the terms of our relationship? But there was also a sense of sadness. The woman I had married was not the woman standing in front of me in that courtroom. She had changed, maybe because of her family, maybe because of the wealth and status she now enjoyed. But whatever the reason, I had lost her long before the divorce papers were filed. That was the hardest part of all, realizing that my love for her had been a one-sided affair. The next few weeks were a blur. I found myself adjusting to life in a way I hadn't expected. The money from the lottery settlement didn't feel as significant as I thought it would. It didn't fill the void left by the broken marriage or the years of emotional manipulation. But it did give me options. I could finally pay off debts, move into a place of my own, and focus on rebuilding my life without looking over my shoulder. I also found that I was rediscovering who I was. The man I had been before all of this, before the prenup and the lottery win, before the manipulation and the heartache. I started spending more time with my friends. They were supportive, but I could see the change in how they looked at me, respect mixed with a bit of awe. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the fact that I had stood my ground. My former in-laws, unsurprisingly, had no interest in reconciling. My father-in-law made a final attempt at reaching out, though it wasn't anything close to an apology. He left a terse voicemail, calling me a disappointment and claiming that I had destroyed their family. My mother-in-law was even more vocal in her disdain. I'd heard through mutual contacts that she was still spreading rumors about me, claiming that I had been nothing more than a gold digger. But those accusations no longer bothered me. I had the facts on my side, and that was all that mattered. A few months after the final hearing, I received a letter from my ex-wife. It was short, impersonal, and essentially a form of closure from her. She apologized for how things had ended and admitted that she had been under a lot of pressure from her parents. She acknowledged that her actions had been unfair to me, but she also expressed that she had no intention of ever reconnecting. I wasn't surprised. I had known that this chapter of my life had come to a definitive end. It wasn't about the apology, nor was it about the money. It was about accepting that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, things just don't work out. People change, situations evolve, and relationships can fracture beyond repair. But in the end, I was okay with that. I had fought for what was mine, and I had walked away with my head held high. Now, I'm focused on the future. I've started a new business, a small venture that reflects my passions and my values. It's not glamorous, but it's mine. Every day, I feel the weight of the past slipping further away, and I'm learning to trust myself again. The wounds from the divorce and the years of manipulation are still there, slowly but surely. The world is wide, and I've got a second chance to live it on my terms. The past may have shaped me, but it won't define me. I've come out of this stronger, wiser, and more determined to create a life that is mine and only mine. The weeks that followed the final settlement were a blur of new beginnings and quiet reflection. I had won the legal battle, but the emotional toll it had taken on me was still raw. I found solace in the simple things: long walks, dinners with old friends, and quiet evenings spent lost in thought. The weight of the past slowly began to lift as I started to rebuild the life that had been taken from me piece by piece. I focused on my work, pouring myself into the business I had started. It wasn't glamorous, nor did it come with the kind of wealth and status I had once been accustomed to, but it felt right. It was mine. Every small success, every step forward, felt like a victory, a reaffirmation that I was more than the sum of my past mistakes and the manipulations of others. My friends noticed the change in me. The man they had known before all this was still there, but now there was a sense of peace about me. I wasn't the broken, defeated person I had been when I first left my ex-wife. I was stronger, more self-assured, and, for the first time in a long while, content with who I had become. And then, one quiet evening, a letter arrived. It was from my ex-wife. The envelope was unmarked, the handwriting unfamiliar, but something about it felt like it had been meant for me. I opened it slowly. Inside was a brief note, simple and to the point. "I've heard about your new business, and I just wanted to say I hope it's going well. I'm glad you're doing what makes you happy." There was no mention of the past, no apology or explanation, just a short, impersonal acknowledgement of the life I had started to rebuild. It was the final piece of closure I needed, though I didn't realize it until that moment. I sat with the letter for a long time, turning it over in my hands. In many ways it felt like a goodbye, a recognition that we had both moved on from what we once had, however painful the process had been. She had her life and I had mine. We were no longer tied by the past, by family expectations, or the bitterness of our failed marriage. The tears I expected to fall never came. Instead, there was a quiet relief, the kind that only comes when you know deep down. I folded the letter and tucked it away, knowing it was time to move forward. There was nothing more to say. The final chapter of that part of my life had been written. I had fought for what was rightfully mine, and I had come out stronger on the other side. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, especially not to her or her family. I had already proven enough to myself. And so I let go. The past was over, and the future was waiting. I started taking small trips, reconnecting with old passions I had let slip away, painting, reading, traveling to places I had always dreamed of. Each experience was a reminder that I still had so much to live for. I even met someone new. It wasn't love at first sight, but there was something comforting in the simplicity of it. For the first time in years, I wasn't comparing her to the woman I had lost. I wasn't haunted by the expectations that had once consumed me. I was simply learning to live again, to love again without the weight of the past holding me back. As the months passed, I realized that the money, the legal victory, and the drama of the divorce no longer mattered. What mattered was the life I was building now, the life I had fought for. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and it was beautiful in its own quiet way. The story of my past, the marriage, the betrayal, the courtroom battles had ended. But it had taught me something invaluable, that no matter how much the world tries to tear you down, you have the power to rebuild, to find your own way, and to become who you were always meant to be. And that in the end was the greatest victory of all.